en otra Pfizer y en otra AstraZeneca. En tu bar donde quieras.
Suerte. Aquí no. Aquí creo que ni te dicen cuál te ponen.
Bueno, os dejo.
Vale. ¿Hello?
Contesta yes en el chat. Un yes. Estamos esperando y dale a enviar. Así.
A ver, espérate.
Te han escrito algunos. Te están escribiendo.
You are in live, Mr. Yo. Hello. Good afternoon, Senator Cassidy. Buenas tardes a todos los que estáis pudiendo asistir a este evento. Senator, thank you very much for attending. We know that you are really busy, and we are very grateful for joining us and for being able to stay with us for the whole hour. So thank you very much. Let me briefly introduce you, and the first thing that I want to say is that Fundación Consejo de España, Estados Unidos, US-Spain Council is a private organization, non-profit, and our aim, our goal is to take care and increase and understand better and better the relationships between the United States and Spain. The United States is a strong friend of our country for many, many years, and we share with you many business and cultural history. My second welcome and gratitude goes for INCIPE. We are very honored to co-organize this event with INCIPE, which is the Instituto de Cuestiones Internacionales y de Política Exterior. It's not the first time in which we organized events with you, and we hope that we will continue to do so because it's very profitable, and we are very happy to be able to be in co-organizing events with you. The current session is dedicated to analyze the current challenges of the US and the priorities of the Republican Party. And it's going to be the first conference that we're going to have in this line. So we are really anxious to hear you, Senator Cassidy. Senator Cassidy, as you all know, is a prominent and well-known senator for Louisiana from the Republican Party in the United States. Bill grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and attended Louisiana State University, LSU, for undergraduate and medical school. And in 1990, Bill joined the LSU Medical School, teaching medical students and residents at Earl K. Long Hospital, a hospital for the uninsured. During this time, he co-founded the Greater Baton Rouge Community Clinic, which is a clinic providing free dental and health care to the working uninsured. Bill also created a private-public partnership to vaccinate 36,000 Great Baton Rouge area children against hepatitis B at no cost to the schools or parents. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, Bill led a group of healthcare volunteers to convert an abandoned Kmart building into an emergency health care facility, providing basic health care to hurricane evacuees. In 2006, Bill was elected to the Louisiana State Senate. In 2008, he was elected to the United States House of Representatives to represent Louisiana 6th Congressional District. In 2014, he was elected to the U.S. Senate, and he serves on the Finance Committee, the Health Education, Labor and Pensions Committee, the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and the Veteran Affairs Committees. Following his successful efforts to lower the cost and healthcare, secure coastal restoration projects to protect Louisiana families from natural disasters, reform our nation's mental health system, and secure many other legislative accomplishments, Bill was re-elected in 2020 to his second term in the U.S. Senate. Bill is married to Dr. Laura Cassidy, and they have 3 children, and Laura is a retired general surgeon specializing in breast cancer. This was a very brief introduction to Senator Cassidy. Senator Cassidy, thank you again very much. And I will now pass on the floor to Ambassador Manuel Lejarreta, which is the Secretary General of Fundación España, Consejo España, Estados Unidos, and who will be the moderator of this act. Thank you very much, Senator.
Thank you, Vice President. Thank you, Gonzalo. Good morning, Senator Bill Cassidy in Washington, D.C., and all our attendees in the United States. We know there are many friends across the ocean following this online event. Good evening also here in Spain. Thank you very much for accompanying us. It is a pleasure to welcome all of you and to conduct this online event. Thank you very much, Senator Cassidy, for being here with us today. We know you have a very tight agenda, especially in those hectic days. We know you've been just voting just minutes before entering this screen. And we know there are many things unfolding now in Washington, D.C. after the arrival of the new administration to the White House. Before giving you the floor to our distinguished guest, let me remind you that you can ask questions to Senator Cassidy either through our YouTube chat or through Twitter account using the hashtag you will see now in the screen, hashtag Grandes Potencias EE.UU. After Senator Cassidy's remarks, we should have around 15-20 minutes for questions and answers. Now, Senator, it is my pleasure to give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both, gentlemen. Thank you for having me. It is an honor to speak to you. You probably know, but just to remind, Louisiana is a state, the only state ever admitted with its articles of statehood published in 3 different languages, French, English, and Spanish. We have a parish called New Iberia. And when I was a child taking Louisiana history, they stressed that the contribution of the Spanish to the American victory and the American Revolution was far understated. In my own city, Baton Rouge, as you mentioned, there's a plaza named after Bernardo de Galvez, and he was the governor of West Florida, I don't know what it was called after that, but Florida, in which he gave refuge to the American revolutionaries and then support in their fight against the British, who at that time controlled Baton Rouge, calling it Fort Richmond. So it is with a wonderful legacy of collaboration between my country and my state that I bring that to this conversation here. And as I thought about what I as a Republican might speak as to Republican priorities, the thought occurred to me, just as our histories, if you will, were together at the time of the American Revolution, in a sense, our present is together now. And I think, although I cannot speak for your country, I think what I describe is not just an issue for the United States, but for an issue for all developed countries, and I'd be interested in your thoughts. One more thing, by the way, I should say, is that as my family and I were in COVID lockdown, we said to ourselves, where in the world will we like to travel when all this is over? Assuming that we could and assuming everything else. and my son nominated and it won that we would go to Spain. So just to say, it's not just the history, but it's also the present of Spain, which I very much like. I will take as a premise that the challenge before the United States of America, therefore the challenge which the Republican Party is attempting to address, is how do you make sure that all Americans have the opportunity and the promise for the future that they have come to expect? And I think there is a particular challenge to achieve this now. And I think the fact that we've been, frankly, unsuccessful is giving rise to some of the political division that is so severe in the United States, but perhaps the political division that is emerging throughout Western Europe and Central and Eastern Europe as well. Indeed, I think some people doubt the legitimacy of government in the United States. If government is supposed to help make sure that people have not just their human needs met, their ability to have food and healthcare and housing, but beyond that, the ability to have their aspirational dreams met, a better education leading to a better job, perhaps the ability to own a business, to see their children have a better future. A lot of Americans feel as if they do not have that opportunity now. So if there's a prism by which I, as a Republican, but I think in general Republicans, look at issues, is how do we make sure that as many as possible, and ideally all, participate not just in having their basic human needs met, but also their aspirations to be realized. Now, by what do I mean? Globalization has, it's almost a cliche, has been an incredible disruptive force on established economic patterns. This is particularly true for those whose jobs were more likely to migrate out of the country in which I live, or perhaps your country, and go to a country such as China or another country in which there's a lower cost of manufacturing, and perhaps other incentives as well. And so if you're someone who had a great job in a community which was centered around a manufacturing plant, and that facility has offshored, not just have you lost your job, but the whole community has lost its tax base. Young people tend to move away. And statistically, those who stay are more likely to have early death, increased incidence of addiction to alcohol or to drugs, and other things. Indeed, there is a term in the United States called death of despair. If it just as one example of what I described, if you look at non-college educated white males between the ages of roughly 35 and 65, their life expectancy is decreasing. Quite remarkable. We're so used to life expectancy increasing across the board in the developed country, but for this subset of the population, and their life expectancy is decreasing because of death from overdose, death from suicide, and death from conditions such as cirrhosis of the liver, which can be attributed to alcoholism, at least in some cases. So and indeed, I think the fact that we have different solutions as a country on how to address this is part of which gives such polarity in our political dialogue, with people at the extremes, left and right, advocating things that formerly would have been beyond the pale, would not have been considered anything close to the mainstream in terms of something that for which you would advocate. But if we don't address these issues, we'll continue to have the legitimacy of government and of other public policies questioned. So I would argue the prism through which we must view every other issue is how do we help that middle income family, that working class family, realize their aspirations, not just basic needs, not just a monthly income support, because statistically, families do better if they're intact and if there is somebody earning money, not just living on transfer payments. And the children do better, and the children and the children and the children of the children do better. So, so with that, let me go through some of the issues which would then be before us. The economy just kind of gives rise to itself. If somebody is making a living on Zoom calls or their equivalent, they're probably doing pretty well right now. Remote work has allowed people to buy a recreational vehicle, to travel across the country, and to Zoom to work. And so they can be driving across the country with one spouse in the driver's seat and the other spouse in the back, conducting their work and having a life which is probably a little bit more pleasurable than before. So if you're making your living at a certain level, a certain type of activity, you may be doing better now, and there's statistical evidence to support that. There is more people buying homes, credit card balances are lower than they used to be, mortgage defaults are lower than they used to be. A lot of evidence that there's a segment of the American population doing better. Who are those, though, who are perhaps doing less well? They are those who would typically be employed in mining, manufacturing, and construction. And I would argue, at least for mining and manufacturing, it's been uneven how those families in which primary breadwinner is employed in those industries have done for some time. I'll develop that. There has been some people would argue that there is no way to stop the offshoring of manufacturing from a developed country to a less developed country. It is going to happen because of lower labor cost and an overall lower cost of doing business. And that might be true. But I don't think that's the entirety of the story. Clearly, a lot of manufacturing has moved to countries which have non-existent environmental standards, or they may have a standard, but they do not enforce it, and labor laws which do not give a labor force the protection that we would expect a labor force to have in a developed country. Now, at this point, if you are a manufacturer, somebody who works in manufacturing, and your company has a choice of whether to build a new facility in the United States or to build it in China, where they again have a lax environmental standards or lax enforcement thereof, and sometimes use slave labor, but certainly don't have the sort of labor protections we have in the United States. Those lax environmental standards and lax labor standards are effectively a subsidy to the business. So the business can either set up in the United States or Spain, or move their operation abroad and produce goods at a lower cost, direct cost. Now, that somehow seems to go against the bargain. And I think those who are losing their jobs in the United States would take issue that the bargain is fair. The economists would say, don't worry, that there is a lower cost of goods being produced. And so therefore the many consumers in the United States benefit from that lower cost. But the individual worker who loses his or her job, yes, they lose their job, but that's just a small subset of the people as opposed to the general benefit that derives from a lower cost. But I still think it's unfair. First, the United States has treaties with Mexico, Canada, with Central American countries. In each of those treaties, we mandate, before the United States will sign on, that there be certain labor standards, environmental standards, and enforcement of those standards in those countries. What that effectively does, though, is increases the cost of production in those countries, and therefore puts them at a competitive disadvantage relative to China. And so the company that might be in Mexico, more likely to take the dollars it earns from the United States from an import-export agreement and spend them back into the United States. Instead is offshoring even from Mexico to China, where the Chinese would spend their money around the world. But still, taking the perspective of that individual worker, the protections that she or he enjoys, both environmentally and in terms of the labor force, actually help price them out of a job. Now, if I'm somebody who is trying to take care of that family who statistically has done poorly over the last couple of decades, I have to look at what makes our labor force less competitive relative to a competitor country. If it is that the competitor country has these lower standards of which we've discussed, therefore placing my labor force at a competitive disadvantage, in a sense, that is a hidden cost to these lower prices that the economist tells me makes it all worth it. I frankly think that there are hidden costs there, which I'll speak of some more hidden costs later, that are not reflected in the price of that good on the store shelf. But if you included the hidden cost, that externality in the price of that good on the store shelf, then maybe we would see the price is not as cheap as it appears. So we have to, as a Republican, find a balance in terms of how do we try and get lower cost. I'm all for free trade, but not at the expense of my workers and our worldwide environment being damaged by a country which subsidizes industry moving to their country by not enforcing the standards they have, or having non-existent standards, or even perhaps using slave labor. This is important. Those workers right now feel as if they are getting the raw end of the deal, to use an American colloquialism. They feel as if it is unfair and that globalization is not working for them. And so they push back against globalization, even though there are tangible benefits which accrue to them. So I do think government has to figure out this tension so that our workers and international environment is protected, but we still have the benefit of a global trading system. Now, it's one thing to speak in abstractions. Let me give two specific examples. I spoke to the CFO of a financial officer, a chief financial officer for a company, and he was describing a company which he formerly worked for. And he said they were making a decision as to whether or not to build a facility in the United States or to build a facility in China. And they made the decision to build in China because in China, they did not have to have the same environmental compliance with scrubbers for sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide. So because of that, their return on investment was 18% in China, and only 8% would they have built in the United States. They said they could not have defended that on an earnings call, and so therefore made the decision to build in China. So we have fewer people working in manufacturing because that plant was built in China, fewer people working in construction to make that plant, to build the plant, to expand the facility, to maintain the facility, fewer people working in the service industry to otherwise support those workers, because another country decided to subsidize the movement of a facility to their country by not demanding environmental standards. Now, I'll come back to this in a bit, but that is a tangible example of how a particular company moved elsewhere out of the United States, costing American jobs because of what I consider effectively a subsidy from another country. Another example, smaller scale, a business was manufacturing or assembling product in Honduras. And the owner just had to put a lot of time into addressing labor issues. Honduras has a treaty with the United States, and on their own, not just because of the treaty, have protections for the workforce. He eventually found it simpler just to go to a contract manufacturing organization, again in China, in which all the labor issues were addressed, and he did not have to deal with it at all. And therefore, even though the transportation across the Pacific was greater than the transportation cost across the Gulf of Mexico, nonetheless, his overall cost of production was lower by building in China. Now, it may be that the Chinese have the same labor protection regime as do the Hondurans, but we all know that there are abusive labor practices in China, and among them slave labor. And I'm not saying that this particular business, that the folks who are doing the manufacturing employed, so to speak, slave labor, but nonetheless, the point being that if you can have lower labor standards and less ability for workers to unionize or otherwise advocate for their rights, that is effectively a subsidy from one low-cost production country to another low-cost production country. Now, there's implications for that for the Western Hemisphere, for the Honduranians, for perhaps migration to the United States for people who are now unemployed, but that would be another part of this discussion. So next thing I will bring up is I've mentioned that if you look at people who don't make their living on a Zoom call, but who are used to having a good working wage with the ability to provide for their future and the future of their family, another source of those jobs has been mining. By mining, I could mean coal, uranium, but I'm from Louisiana, and so I'll specifically speak of the oil and gas industry. Now, we need to be concerned about climate change. Absolutely, and I will speak to that in a bit. But if you have a policy which assumes that if you just don't produce the oil and gas, somehow you improve climate change, that is silly, it is ridiculous, it is absurd. Everybody who forecasts global use of fossil fuels forecasts that demand will remain about where it is for the next 4 or 5 decades. And if the United States does not produce that oil and gas, somebody else will. We had testimony in the Energy Committee recently in which one of the folks speaking, who said, I'm a Canadian, he's saying this proactively, I'm a Canadian, not an American, not trying to pick a side here, but he said demonstrably, the environmental standards employed by the United States and by Western European countries is of a higher level than the environmental standards employed by countries such as Russia. There was an article, a set of articles that have come out in the American press in the last 2 weeks, that even if the United States decreases or stops oil and gas production, it will not decrease worldwide consumption of fossil fuel. Rather, it's just that other countries will produce more, filling the void created by the United States not producing our own natural resource. So if I'm taking my prism, how do I provide a better living for that family which may or may not have a college education, but they're good people? And right now with overtime, they may be making $100,000 a year working in the oil and gas industry. Their job is eliminated, but global greenhouse gas emissions increase because instead of producing the natural gas that we're going to use anyway, in the United States with our environmental standards, creating jobs for Americans, instead, those are being created in another country, for example, Russia or Iran. Now, just as an aside, I will say that inherent in what I just said is that by allowing Russia and Iran to increase their production, because we create a vacuum, if you will, it strengthens their economy and strengthens them vis-a-vis the geopolitical competition, which is currently between Russia Iran, and the West. Put differently, the degree to which Western countries are producing something in an environment, in a more environmentally sensitive way, strengthening our country's economies and our workforces. And by the way, putting a product out into the international market, which drives down market share for a country like Iran and Russia, is the degree to which we in the West are strengthened geopolitically. So the worker has a better job, there's net decrease in global greenhouse gas emissions, and the West is strengthened geopolitically. Now, why anybody in the Biden administration or on the Democratic side would want to pretend that is false, it is a pretending that is not based in facts or reality or science or logic. And as a Republican, that would be something, a perspective that I would attempt to advance. Not just for the Republican Party, not at all, but for that worker who might lose their job because of this administration's policies, and for the Western countries, which I still think are culturally and geopolitically a unit standing for values which the rest of the world would be better to adopt. Now, by the way, some listening to this might say, well, you're a Republican. Maybe you don't care about climate change. That is not true. As a Republican, I've been speaking to climate change over the last decade. No one notices it because it's a little bit, it goes against the stereotype. But, there's this paper trail of me talking about it. And in part because Louisiana, that state which your ancestors helped free, so that my ancestors from Ireland could come here and enjoy the fruits of my great country, is the state most impacted by rising sea levels. I mean, again, Louisiana, of all the states in the United States, is the one who's lost more landmass because of relative sea level rise. So it is an existential issue for Louisiana to address the issue of climate change with rising sea levels. But there is a way to do it while acknowledging that the rest of the world is going to be using fossil fuels for some time. As a Republican, along with other Republicans, I advocate the use of things such as taking methane or natural gas, taking the hydrogen off of the carbon molecule, the CO2, the methane molecule, using the hydrogen atoms to make a hydrogen molecule, which can then be used for propulsion, for transportation purposes, if you will, and sequestering the carbon underground in a carbon capture and underground storage regime. Now, that way, we're producing hydrogen, which I understand that the European Union is using more of. It is a way to have blue hydrogen, a carbon-free technology to actually propel to fuel, if you will, 18-wheelers, big push boats and tugboats on the Mississippi River, other large structures which are unlikely to be powered by electrification of motors. We have other responses like that, which again would preserve employment for that family, which is going to be most vulnerable to public policy changes. They could continue to produce the natural gas, continue to build pipelines, but they would also build CO2 pipelines, which would then go to CCUS storage facilities after passing through a place in which hydrogen atoms are taken off the natural gas and used to form a new transportation fuel, which would be a hydrogen cell. In this way, we use technology to preserve jobs for those Americans who if we don't have their support, they will fight, they will oppose, they will be active against achieving the goals of lowering global greenhouse gas emissions. But if we put in the wiser policy guided by science and by empiricism, then we will not only preserve their jobs, but we will lower global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, that brings me to foreign policy. I'll speak to that and then hopefully have time for some questions. Although I think I'm almost out of time. I do think that the West, the United States and the EU must join together to prevent abuse of the international trading system by the Chinese in particular, who have, I've mentioned earlier, effectively subsidized their competition with the West economically with everything which I've already spoken of. There's also a concern to go back to that family which is struggling. In the United States, we have a high incidence of overdoses from opioids. These are drugs that are being manufactured in China and in Mexico, and transnational criminal organizations are helping to sell them into the United States and then laundering the dollars back out of the United States worldwide. Now, these transnational criminal organizations are often based in Mexico, but they are truly transnational, forming partnerships not just with Chinese organized crime, but also with Hezbollah and other terrorist organizations, in which dollars from drugs being sold in the US are laundered out of the United States, oftentimes using legitimate trade to launder illicit income. It goes through South America, through the Western Horn of Africa, and up to support terrorist organizations such as Hezbollah and perhaps the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. These same groups are said to bring contraband, counterfeit cigarettes out of South America to the EU, where they are sold, excise tax is not collected, which therefore deprives European governments of the revenue that they would need for the functions of government. Now, go back to that family. They are dying of addiction. We must do something about this, this linkage between them dying of addiction and the financing of this illicit trade, which then results in many other things. But also go back to the fact that countries have a loss of tax revenue from which they get better support programs to help such families, because these transnational criminal organizations are not paying taxes on their illicit gains. One thing I've been very interested in is the threat networks, which include counterfeit goods, trade-based money laundering, and other such activities. It will require transnational cooperation between countries such as the United States and Spain to address this, because the criminal organizations are transnational. So I look forward to working with you on that, and of course can address that more. Lastly, let me thank you once more for having me. I'm pleased to be here. I'll be even more pleased when I see one of you on the Mediterranean coast of Spain, and we can both maybe continue the conversation as my family plays in the beach. So, Mr. Ambassador.
So thank you very much, Senator, for this wide explanation about different issues that are of the utmost interest. We have some questions regarding globalization, regarding the economy. It's clear that you are serving in the Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. Thank you very much for your knowledge about that. But I have a question from Pedro Delgado, who says, Senator, from an environmental pollution point of view, what do you think of fracking in the U.S.?
Yes, fracking in the U.S. has unleashed a natural gas boom. And that natural gas has lowered United States greenhouse gas emissions. In absolute amounts, the U.S. has less greenhouse gas emissions now than it did in 2005, even though I think we have 30 million more Americans than we did in 2005, even though our economy is a couple $1 trillion larger than it was in 2005, and even though we're producing far more energy, which theoretically would increase greenhouse gas emissions, in absolute amounts, we have lower greenhouse gas emissions. And by the way, we have helped create jobs for millions of Americans along the way. The reason that we have lower emissions is that natural gas has replaced coal as a feedstock to power the electrical grid. It has replaced oil as a feedstock for the chemicals and the plastics, which are essential to modern life. And so clearly, empirically, the fracking revolution has dramatically improved America's greenhouse gas emissions profile and has the potential to do that worldwide as well. One example, imagine if the Chinese, who use 60% of their energy electric grid is powered by coal, switch to natural gas. Natural gas has only 1/2 the carbon footprint per unit of energy as does coal. If the Chinese swapped out completely coal to natural gas, they would dramatically bring down their global greenhouse gas emission profile.
So thank you very much for your interesting answer. We have some questions regarding foreign policy. For instance, there is a question very specific about China and Taiwan. Senator, will the U.S. defend Taiwan in case of an open attack by China? What's the main view in the Republican Party about this delicate issue?
It has always been the policy of the United States to help Taiwan in their defense. I think there's always a certain vagueness about that, and I think that vagueness is on purpose, but the United States has clearly demonstrated that it would. China has now become understood as a threat to democracy. You only have to look at what has happened in Hong Kong to understand that this is the case. And the Chinese would make the case that this is just a cultural system and that the West does not understand, but that those in the Chinese sphere, if you will, welcome their sort of authoritarian government. That's clearly not true, as is seen from the protests that the Hong Kongers have exhibited their bravery in terms of resisting the Chinese takeover of their country, and the passion with which the Taiwanese wish to remain independent. So yes, the United States is committed to protecting the Taiwanese, and I think the recent actions towards Hong Kong suggest why that is a good idea if someone believes in democracy.
Thank you. Another question. As you mentioned before, it seems that we are going through a kind of reshaping of the world order, international world order, liberal order. And there is an attendee who asked, how important do you consider the transatlantic relationship facing up to countries challenging the post-1945 order?
Say that one more time, please.
Yes. How important do you consider the transatlantic relation in facing up to countries that would like to challenge the post-1945 order?
So that is there has to be a nuanced answer to that. I have spoken about China, get my tie straight. I've spoken about China, but I don't want China to be an enemy. I want China to comply with the standards that we expect a country like Spain, the United States, and Japan, Australia, other countries are expected to comply with. For example, don't use slave labor. Don't subsidize your industry by absent environmental standards. So I don't want them perceived as an enemy, rather perceived as someone who will bend and break and exploit the rules as much as possible to their advantage. So therefore, it's important for those who believe in those rules to have a united front. Now, one of those we've seen therefore, the EU and the United States have a mutual interest, along with other countries, Japan and Australia, etc., have a mutual interest in making sure these rules are enforced. I also think we've seen recently that Russia has been quite willing to do things that are destructive to world order. So I think there's also a need to be, not just China, but other countries as well, to be united. How do we put a practical face upon that? Prior to the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a decision to have all things essential for a modern economy with some source within a country that was either a NATO country or a country such as Japan or Australia, in which those similar defense links were there. So, for example, certain pharmaceuticals were made in Italy so that the United States would have access, so would people from Spain. If the Chinese decided to embargo and not ship goods that would be essential to fight certain infections, that's okay because we had an alternative supply. I think we need to think about that again, because if you talk about penicillins and another class of drugs called cephalosporins, I'm told that 100% of them are now formed in China. If there happened to be global tension and that China decided to, they could put an embargo on those antibiotics coming to the US and the West, and we would be vulnerable to the infections those antibiotics fight. In my sense, we need to at least have some dispersion of critical biohealth and manufacturing goods throughout these countries which have a tradition of being security allies, in which we would each have okay, I can't have it here, but we have a great relationship with Mexico, and we know we can get it from there, a great relationship with Spain, and we can send it to Spain, but they can send us something else. So I think even though it will increase cost marginally, there has to be a strategy, a security strategy, in which key things are manufacturing of key goods are distributed through these countries which are allied.
Thank you. We have a question about Iran. How do you see the possibility of the United States returning back in the short term to nuclear agreement with Iran that former President Trump abandoned in 2018?
Well, the Biden administration has made a commitment to rejoining the JCPOA, and Iran obviously is again pushing the elements. I think that as currently configured, the Iranians are a regime which sponsors international terror. They have killed people in Europe with their secret police. They have attempted to kill people in the United States. They're actively supporting terrorist organizations spreading around the world. So it is with great circumspection that the West should engage with the Iranians with very clear red lines, which if they do not comply, then everything is off. I think it's fair to say that there's an internal pressure building in Iran. The support for the regime has always come from the rural areas. A couple of years ago, there was widespread outbreaks of resistance to the regime within the rural areas. So the hyperinflation, the mismanagement of the economy, and the sanctions have served to somewhat limit the progress. Make no mistake about it. The Iranians are a great people. They've got an incredible legacy. The Iranian Americans in my country are inevitably sterling citizens who contribute tremendously to our country. It is a regime which takes that great people and it thwarts their progress. So if the Biden administration determines it's their decision to go back into the JCPOA, that's something we'll live with. That's why you have presidential elections. But I do think it's incumbent upon the rest of us to recognize there is a regime that has been very supportive of international terror, that thwarts the aspirations of their people, and in some cases supports criminal activities within our countries, and therefore we must be very vigilant as to their activities.
Thank you. We have now a question very specific about relation between Spain and the United States, about trade. One attendee asked, what is your expectation of the timing of when the US government will reduce or eliminate the import duties on Spanish products such as olive oil? As you may know, olive oil is a very important product for export of Spain.
Yeah, I think this administration will have a different attitude towards trade than does the Trump administration. So in one sense, I can't answer that. Beyond that, I think that it is in the interest of both our countries to have as low trade barriers as possible. I know that agriculture has been a sticking point. Frankly, American farmers feel as if they would have greater access to markets were it not for some of the EU tariffs placed upon our goods. And some of them are phytosanitary, suggesting that, you know, our products, because they may have a genetic alteration or whatever, are somehow unfit. So there is a tension and a trade-off there. I probably could ask the questioner, when does he or she think that there will be something reciprocal so that our agricultural lobby would lower its objections, in turn giving the policymakers the greater freedom to lower tariffs upon those products being brought here. On the other hand, I love Spanish olive oil, so I hope it happens soon. Mr. Ambassador, they just called me to vote for my second time, so I must depart, but thank you for a very stimulating conversation.
So thank you very much. Time has quickly gone and we must finish now. It has been a very interesting debate and speech. I'm sure that our followers haven't reached themselves. And well, in a few days, we will announce who will be our next speaker and the date. Thank you again, Senador Cassidy. We wish you all the best in your important job. And hopefully we can welcome you in some months in Spain with the aim to continue strengthening relation between Spain and the United States. And well, that's all. Thank you very much also for your staff. That has been very helpful. And have a good day. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Okay.